A few minutes before 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, the sailors on board Navy warships in Pearl Harbor are preparing for morning colors, as usual. The bands on the battleships are ready to play the national anthem. On this morning, however, the routine is interrupted when a cloud of 183 airplanes appears overhead. Some witnesses assume they must be friendly aircraft engaged in maneuvers. One officer, annoyed that the planes are flying so low, tried to read their tail numbers so he could report them to the appropriate squadron commander. Then the first bombs exploded. In the ensuing pandemonium, formal protocols are discarded. On the battleship Nevada, a voice over the public address system announces, "This is a real Jap air attack and no shit." Bombs and torpedoes smash into the American ships. American aircraft are strafed on the runways of Hickam Field. The onslaught lasts half an hour before the enemy planes depart. Then, after a brief hiatus, a second wave of 170 more planes arrives. This time, the Americans are prepared, and they shoot down 24 of the attacking aircraft. But when the last of the attacking planes depart, 4 American battleships have been sunk and 4 more severely damaged. Altogether, the Japanese have sunk or damaged 18 U.S. Navy warships, destroyed 188 American airplanes, and damaged 159 others, and killed 2,403 U.S. servicemen, nearly half of them on the battleship Arizona. At the time, the Japanese celebrated what felt like a great victory. But in hindsight, it is evident that this attack on the United States fleet in Pearl Harbor might have been the most self-destructive strategic decision ever made by a great power. It galvanized an otherwise indifferent American public and all but assured Japan's ultimate defeat in the destructive war that followed. So why did the Japanese do it? To answer that, we have to go back to 1937, when Japan invaded China. In that war, Japanese armies won great victories and captured thousands of square miles of Chinese territory, but China is enormous, and its defeated armies often retreated to fight another day, and then another day, and another. After several years of this, Japan's military leaders found themselves overextended, frustrated, and desperate. To sustain the war they had started, they needed unrestricted access to the raw materials of war: iron, rubber, tin, and especially oil, the life's blood of 20th century warfare. Japan had to import virtually all of its oil, mostly from the United States. And the United States was threatening to use its economic leverage to pressure Japan to stop its war in China. So as the Japanese saw it, they either had to bow to American pressure or find oil somewhere else. And there was an alternative. The European colonies of South Asia, French Indochina, British Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies were rich in the very resources that Japan so desperately needed, and they were ripe for the picking. The Nazi war machine had overrun both Holland and France, and Britain appeared to be on the brink of collapse. Seizing their resource-rich and orphaned colonies was far more appealing to Japanese military leaders than kowtowing to the United States. But would the United States stand by and watch while Japan occupied those colonies? It was an important question because Japanese tankers carrying oil from South Asia back to Japan would have to steam past the American-held Philippines. Because of that, the Japanese High Command decided that the Philippines too had to be occupied, and that meant war with the United States as well as with Britain and Holland. It was a terrible miscalculation. Given the powerful isolationist sentiment that existed in the United States at the time, it is virtually inconceivable that President Franklin Roosevelt could have convinced the American public to go to war with Japan to protect the colonies of European empires. A second Japanese miscalculation was their assumption that after their planes knocked out the U.S. battleship fleet, the Americans would be so demoralized they would agree to negotiate and reach some kind of settlement. Instead, it awoke the sleeping giant. The Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor did cripple the American battleship fleet, but only temporarily. Most of the ships they sunk or damaged were eventually raised, repaired, and sent back into the war. Quite apart from that, the Japanese missed two other objectives that were far more strategically valuable than the battleships. On the slopes of Macalapa Hill, behind the harbor anchorage, was a field of fuel oil tanks. The Japanese should have appreciated how important that stored fuel was, considering that obtaining a secure oil supply was their principal motive for going to war in the first place. Had they destroyed the oil tanks instead of the battleships, the U.S. Pacific Fleet could have been immobilized for months. The other strategic objective the Japanese missed was the American aircraft carriers, which they had expected to find at Pearl Harbor. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who ordered the attack, had made the American carriers a high priority. But when the Japanese planes swooped down onto Pearl Harbor that Sunday morning, no American carriers were there. Where were they? Conspiracy theories always orbit great historical events, from JFK's assassination to the moon landing. Those who are intrigued by such speculation sometimes suggest that the reason the American carriers were not in port that day was because President Roosevelt, or perhaps someone else in authority, knew about the Japanese attack in advance and deliberately got the carriers out of the way. It is simply not true. Of the 4 large-deck aircraft carriers the U.S. Navy had in the Pacific in 1941, one of them, the Yorktown, had been ordered to the Atlantic in April to bolster the ongoing, though still undeclared, war against German U-boats. Another, the Saratoga, was in Bremerton, Washington, for a long-scheduled refit. The other 2, Lexington and Enterprise, were delivering fighter planes to Wake Island, 2,300 miles to the west, and Midway, 1,300 miles to the northwest. They were engaged in doing so because 2 weeks before, on November 27th, Washington had sent out a war warning to all Pacific commanders. War with Japan could start at any moment, it said, and it would be advisable to reinforce vulnerable outposts. The American fleet commander in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel, therefore sent his 2 available carriers, Lexington and Enterprise, with reinforcement squadrons for Wake and Midway. That's why there were no carriers in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. It was not a conspiracy, though it was fortuitous because, as events would demonstrate, aircraft carriers and not battleships would be the dominant weapon of naval warfare in the ensuing war. Before we look further at the particular role played by aircraft carriers in the Pacific War, let me say a word or two about Admiral Kimmel, who was held to be at fault for the fleet's unreadiness. Kimmel was realistic enough to appreciate that under the circumstances he could not retain his job. It is a long-held tradition in the Navy that a commanding officer is ultimately responsible for a reversal, whether he was actually at fault or not. In that tradition, Kimmel resigned his post on December 17th, though he fully expected that a subsequent court-martial would exonerate him. Instead, the country and the Navy Department found it useful to hold him accountable. Both he and Walter Short, the Army commander on the island, were effectively shelved. Kimmel never got his day in court, and ever since then his defenders, and especially his family members, have insisted that he was essentially scapegoated. They wanted his reputation restored and his 4-star rank restored. Their first demand is not unreasonable. In my own view, Kimmel was more unlucky than blameworthy. As his eventual successor, Chester Nimitz, said to him, "It could have happened to anyone." On the other hand, the demand that Kimmel should have his 4-star rank restored is misplaced. The job of Pacific Fleet Commander carried with it an automatic but also temporary promotion to full admiral, that is, one with 4 stars. But when the commander, any commander, rotated out of the job, he automatically reverted to his previous rank. That had been true for all of Kimmel's predecessors, as well as for Kimmel himself. There was no precedent for allowing Kimmel to retain 4 stars after he left the job. The central theme of today's story, however, is not fault-finding. It's the emergent role of the aircraft carrier in naval warfare. So let me return to that. The destruction of the American battleship fleet in Pearl Harbor is a useful metaphor for the fact that carriers had eclipsed battleships as the dominant weapon of naval warfare. While the battleship's big guns could hit targets 15 miles away, planes from carriers could strike targets more than 100 miles away. Naval officers had seen this coming. As early as the 1920s, when the first large deck carriers came into service in both Japan and the United States, far-sighted naval officers had seen that carriers were the future. One important characteristic of carrier operations then and now is that they cannot operate alone. For all their offensive capability, they are vulnerable to airstrikes and submarines and had to be accompanied by cruisers and destroyers. Grouping a carrier, 2 or 3 cruisers, 5 or 6 destroyers, plus an oiler or 2, to keep all those ships full of fuel, made up what was called a task force. And it was the carrier task force that proved to be the essential element of naval warfare in the Pacific theater of World War II. Generally, these task forces operated in a circular formation, with the carrier in the center, surrounded by a protective ring of cruisers and destroyers. Each of the big carriers, Japanese or American, hosted 3 types of airplanes: bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. All 3 types were single-engine airplanes. 2-engine planes could not fit on the giant elevators that lowered planes from the flight deck down to the hangar deck. The bombers usually had a crew of 2, a pilot in front and an air crewman behind him who was responsible for navigation, communication, and fending off hostile planes with a machine gun. While they could bomb from altitude, the most effective type of bomber was a dive bomber. They approached an enemy target from high altitude, usually 15 to 20,000 feet, then dove almost straight down on the target. At about 1,500 feet, the pilot released the bomb, then pulled out, the G-forces compressing him and his backseat gunner into their seats. The torpedo planes were bigger than the dive bombers because they had to lug around a much heavier weapon. A bomber might carry a 1,000-pound bomb, but a torpedo weighed twice that. And while the dive bombers attacked from altitude, torpedo planes came in low. Often they approached the targeted ship only 100 feet above the wave tops. They also came in slow, because dropping the torpedo at high speed could cause it to detonate prematurely. And finally, the torpedo planes had to get fairly close to the target for the torpedo to complete its run. The third type of aircraft on carriers was the fighter plane. These single-seat planes were faster and more maneuverable, and while they could deliver small bombs in a pinch, their principal weapon was the machine guns they carried in their wings. The function of the fighter planes was twofold. Some circled above the task force to protect it from enemy airstrikes, a protocol called Combat Air Patrol, or CAP. Others accompanied the bombers and torpedo planes on their strike missions to protect them from enemy CAP. During the first few months of 1942, Kimmel's successor, Admiral Chester Nimitz, sent one or another of his carrier task forces to strike targets in the South and Central Pacific, even as far west as Marcus Island, only about 1,000 miles from Japan's homeland. The most famous carrier strike that year, however, was one led by Army General James "Jimmy" Doolittle against Tokyo and other cities in Japan itself. From the very first days of the war, President Roosevelt and Admiral Ernest J. King, the American Chief of Naval Operations, wanted to find a way to strike back at Japan in retaliation for the Pearl Harbor attack. Sending a carrier task force to within 150 miles of Japan, launching a strike, then asking them to wait there for most of a day for the planes to return was simply too risky. A lot of effort was put into trying to fly Army bombers from Chinese airfields, but the logistics of that proved too challenging. The solution, or at least a solution, was to fly land-based Army bombers off of a Navy carrier. The bigger Army planes could launch from much further away, 400 or 500 miles out. And while such planes could not land on a carrier afterward, they could drop their bombs over Japan and then fly onward to land somewhere in China. Such a raid would not be strategically meaningful, but it would be psychologically satisfying. The raid took place in April 1942. In San Francisco Bay, 16 big two-engine Army B-25 bombers were hoisted by crane onto the deck of the Navy's newest aircraft carrier, the Hornet, which then steamed westward across the Pacific. The B-25s were too big to use the ship's elevators, so they had to stay strapped down on the flight deck. Thus encumbered, the Hornet could not conduct regular flight operations, so a second carrier, the Enterprise, accompanied her. That meant that fully half of America's total carrier strength in the Pacific was devoted to what amounted to a morale-raising mission. The mission itself was successful. The damage done to Japanese cities, including Tokyo, was minimal, but the banner headlines at home were gratifying. While all of the American planes were lost, most of the Doolittle raiders eventually got home safely. Still, as Nimitz had feared, sending two carriers off on this mission severely limited what he could do elsewhere. Even as Doolittle's men carried out their mission, American code breakers, what was called Station Hypo in Hawaii, brought Nimitz news that the Japanese planned to send an invasion force through the Coral Sea to capture Port Moresby on the south coast of New Guinea. Though it was great to have such excellent intelligence, it was less clear what Nimitz should do about it. If he sent his only other 2 carriers to try to stop the threat to Port Moresby, they would confront a much larger enemy force, and Nimitz would have no reserve if they were lost. Nevertheless, Nimitz decided he could not ignore the advantage provided by the codebreakers, so he sent both the Lexington and the Yorktown. The Battle of the Coral Sea took place during the second week of May, and it was historic in several ways, including the fact that it was the first naval battle in history fought entirely by carrier-based aircraft. Neither of the opposing fleets ever actually sighted one another. All of the fighting was done by airplanes. At that moment, the Japanese planes and pilots were probably the best in the world. They sank the Lexington, the largest carrier in the U.S. Navy, and damaged the Yorktown, and they also sank 2 other ships, the oiler Neosho and the destroyer Sims. For their part, American pilots sank the small Japanese carrier Shoho and severely damaged the much larger Shokaku, hitting her with 3 500-pound bombs and forcing her to retire from the fight. On balance, the Japanese inflicted more damage on the Americans than they received in return. The most important result of this battle, however, was that the Japanese decided to recall the invasion fleet that was headed for Port Moresby. So while the Japanese won a tactical victory in the Coral Sea, it was a strategic success for the Americans. Meanwhile, Admiral Nimitz got another critical piece of information from the codebreakers at Station Hypo. The code-breaking team, led by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, could not read every intercepted Japanese message, but after a lot of tedious work, they could often figure out bits and pieces of the messages, and they used their familiarity with Japanese culture to fill in the blanks. It was a valuable secret weapon that gave the United States a meaningful advantage, and it was never more important than in May and June of 1942. What the codebreakers told Nimitz now was that a Japanese force that included 4, possibly 5 carriers was likely to attack the tiny American outpost of Midway Atoll, just over 1,000 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. The attack, Rochefort reported, would take place sometime during the first week of June. Once again, the question was what to do about it. Midway was a tiny outpost, barely large enough for an airstrip, though it was strategically located. With the Lexington gone and the Yorktown badly crippled, should Nimitz risk confronting this oncoming Japanese armada with his 2 remaining carriers? Even if the Yorktown could be patched up in time, which was no sure thing, the Americans would still be outnumbered. Once again, Nimitz decided that the advance information provided by Rochefort's codebreakers, plus the ability to fly planes from Midway itself, evened the odds enough to justify accepting battle. Still, it was a remarkably bold decision. And there was one more wrinkle. The man Nimitz had counted on to lead his 2 or maybe 3 carriers into that battle was Vice Admiral Bill Halsey, who had led the Doolittle raid. But when he reported to Nimitz's office, Halsey was suffering from a terrible skin disease, very likely shingles, and in no condition to command the upcoming battle. Aware of that, Halsey recommended that his escort group commander, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, should be his temporary replacement. And Nimitz agreed. As it turned out, the yard workers at Pearl Harbor managed to repair the Yorktown in time to take part in the battle. The commander of the Yorktown Task Force was Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, and because he was senior to Spruance, he would exercise overall command of the 3 U.S. carriers during the battle to defend Midway. In hopes of springing an ambush, Nimitz sent his 3 carriers some 1,400 miles to the north, several hundred miles north of Midway itself. The Japanese, unaware that their codes had been compromised or that the American carriers were lurking nearby, launched their planned airstrike against Midway on the morning of June 4th, 1942. At almost the same moment, American planes on the Enterprise and Hornet took off and flew southward. About an hour later, after recovering the search planes sent out at first light, planes from the Yorktown headed off in the same direction. The American attack did not go according to plan. First of all, most of the planes from the carrier Hornet went the wrong way. Suspecting there might be other Japanese carriers to the west, they flew off in that direction and never got into the fight at all. The 15 planes of the Hornet's torpedo squadron, defying the orders of the air group commander, flew to the southwest. They were the first to find the Japanese carrier force known as the Kido Butai. But attacking unsupported, all 15 of them were shot down and only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived. The planes from the carrier Enterprise also flew southward, but they initially missed seeing the Japanese carriers. A key turning point in the battle was when that air group commander, Wade McCluskey, spotted a wayward Japanese destroyer and decided to follow its track northward. His hunch paid off, and he found the Kido Butai at about 10:25 that morning. Entirely by coincidence, the planes from the Yorktown, which had launched later but flown a more direct course, arrived as well. The whole course of the Pacific War was about to change. Because the Japanese Zero fighters had been drawn down to low altitude by the early attack of the American torpedo planes, when the high-flying American dive bombers arrived overhead, there were no Zeros there to intercept them. Unmolested, the American pilots pushed over into their dives. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were on fire and sinking. It was quite literally the turning point of the Pacific War. And it wasn't over yet. That afternoon, a second strike by American dive bombers found and attacked the 4th Japanese carrier, which sank later that night. The Americans did not get off unscathed. Japanese planes found and hit the Yorktown, first with bombs, then with torpedoes. And while it was limping back to Pearl Harbor under tow, it was hit again by a torpedo from a Japanese submarine, and it finally succumbed. Still, the destruction of 4 large-deck Japanese aircraft carriers in a single battle, indeed in a single day, made the Battle of Midway one of the most transformational naval battles in history. The Japanese had held the initiative in the war ever since their attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months before. Now the initiative belonged to the Americans. There were other carrier battles that year. In the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August, the Americans and the Japanese again traded blows from long range. In what was very nearly a clone of the battle in the Coral Sea, the Americans sank a small Japanese carrier and damaged a larger one, while suffering serious damage to the carrier Enterprise. The Americans also sank a destroyer and a transport and destroyed 33 Japanese aircraft. Far more important, however, was the fact that, as in the Coral Sea, the Japanese recalled the reinforcement convoy that was headed for Guadalcanal, and that made the Battle of the Eastern Solomons an American strategic victory. 2 months later, in October, the two sides' carrier forces tangled again in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. This time, the Japanese had the better of it, sinking the Hornet and severely damaging the Enterprise. The Japanese were unable to take full advantage of their tactical success, however, partly because they suffered so many losses in both planes and pilots. If you're interested, I discuss all these battles and others in more detail in another Wondrium program, World War II, the Pacific Theater. What these battles during 1942 demonstrated unequivocally was that the aircraft carrier, and not the battleship, had become the decisive weapon of naval warfare. At the beginning of the year, Japanese carrier-based pilots had been the best in the world, but the heavy attrition they suffered in the Coral Sea, at Midway, and elsewhere, combined with the arrival of more American planes and pilots, meant that by the end of the year, the qualitative advantage they had once enjoyed had all but evaporated.